transportation landscape. And Ariane Van Andel, the Director of Business Development and Marketing Traffic Lead for Moss North America PTV Group. My God, he must have 3 cards to take his handle up. He should be online. Ariane, are you online?
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. So you're going to now moderate this session. And is Jarvis there too? Is that Jarvis there to your right?
Yep, that's
okay,
me.
Fantastic. Okay, great. It's all yours.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Would like to say welcome from DC. So, yeah, sorry for not being there local, but our travel restricted us to come in to staying here in the DC. But we try to make the best out of this year and do the session still by basically video conferencing. So we were saying like, hey, what can we do even remotely with these technologies? So good afternoon, everyone. This session is basically about micromobility and making sure that people can get to their jobs in different ways. And it's to traveling short distances, as the description says. More people are just changing their cars for smaller vehicles, sometimes electrical vehicles. And this session is all about this micromobility. So what I would want to do is first ask the panelists to give a brief introduction about themselves. And I see to my left on the video screen, there's no chair, is Jarvis. So maybe Jarvis, we said like we should actually have 2 extra chairs next to Susan and Tilly, right? With the 2 teddy bears on there, right? You could probably do the handshaking or the moving for the bears when we're talking, right?
That's right.
But unfortunately, we were too late with our request. So first, I think maybe Jarvis, do you want to give a little bit of a background about yourself before we get more into detail about this session here?
Yeah, thanks, Arjun. My name's Jarvis Murray, and I'm actually the for-hire policy and enforcement administrator here for the Los Angeles Department of Transportation. And in our department, we oversee basically rules and regulations and permitting. And that's primarily for taxi cabs, non-emergency medical vehicles, ambulances, shuttles, and as well as the dockless program. And here in LA, a great part of our intent in putting together our programs is that we wanted to create a system whereby we could easily plug in any new mode. So essentially my department manages all, the enforcement as well as the permitting of modes. And so, we're trying to develop a system whereby whether it's the e-scooters or mopeds or autonomous vehicles or urban air mobility, we can just plug it into our system. And that's the big thing that LA is working on. My background is I have a legal background, and I used to actually work in the Bay Area. I was a longtime resident there, and I attended law school there. And I worked for the San Francisco MTA for numerous years in their taxis and accessible services department. So I do have some familiarity with Tilly, who's up there, I think. And I've worked with Susan. She's been a major part of a big program we're working on here in LA. And so I think you guys can talk about yourselves there.
Right, thanks Jarvis, much appreciated. Next to you, I see Susan in the chair, right, to your left. So Susan, would you also can you also give a short background about yourself to the audience, please?
Yeah, sure. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see so many people here at the event in person. We have been studying forms of shared mobility, including micromobility, at the University of California, Berkeley for a really long time. In fact, we were, I think, among the very first to deploy a bike sharing system in Contra Costa County back in 2009 or 10. Actually, it was before 2010. It was 2009. We called it Easy Connect. Randy may even remember that project. I think he helped me cut the ribbon on it, perhaps, when he was a Caltrans director. And we've been doing a lot of work in that capacity for a long time, and have really started to focus on this new form of shared micromobility. Micromobility, of course, is much bigger than sharing, because it just could be active transportation itself, people getting on their own bikes and on their own scooters or using their own 2 feet to walk. And sometimes I find that people conflate the concept of shared micromobility with micromobility as though they are the same thing, and they actually aren't. And in terms of my background, I am a professor in civil and environmental engineering at the University of California, Berkeley, and I also lead a center there that focuses on transportation sustainability, and our portfolio of research includes everything from automation and electronic and wireless communication systems to alternative fuel technologies, and I think in particular where we've made a bit of a hallmark in the field in terms of our research over the last 2 decades is in the area of innovative and shared mobility.
Great. Thanks, thanks, Susan. Last one, Tilly, can you give a brief background about yourself as well?
Sure. Thank you for having me. Tilly Chang, Executive Director of the San Francisco County Transportation Authority. It's a sister agency of CCTA. So as the County Congestion Management Agency in San Francisco, our agency is charged with doing some planning, evaluation, coordination, really, of all the different services in San Francisco, whether they're local, whether they're regional, anything that touches our county. And so, of course, being sort of home base for a lot of the transformative new services that we've seen over the last 5 to 10 years, we've taken a keen interest in documenting that, analyzing it, advising our board, which is the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, and partnering with our sister agency, which is the SFMTA. Many of you will know them as the folks who run Muni and operate parking and traffic. They are also the sort of new mobility permitting agency for San Francisco. So happy to talk about this topic today.
Thanks, much appreciated. I think for the audience, I'm only seeing you all, so if the audience, someone is waving or saying that something is wrong, please let me know. You guys gotta tell us, because Jarvis and I, we only see you on the video, so we don't see if anyone is smiling, waving, and saying that we need to stop. So we kind of need to get a code here going on, I guess, right? So, but anyhow, for the start, I think for the goal of the session, when we discussed this earlier, is really what we'd like is to give people a better idea about what it is, the micromobility, and share some best practices, and of course that people know, like, hey, what are some success stories, what are frameworks of successes to happen, and how can we focus on multiple aspects of micromobility. So for example, like what it is with how does it work with TNCs, how does it impact equity, finance, regulation, does it impact urban design, curb management. So all of those things we kind of want to cover during this session. And we just want to start briefly with saying, like, hey, what is micromobility? Because there's so many discussions out about micromobility. Some people say it's about bikes, some it's scooters. So Jarvis, maybe you can give your view on that and saying, like, hey, micromobility as a city of LA, how do you define micromobility?
Well, I think actually Susan's probably the best person to answer the question. But here in LA, we define micromobility simply as the e-scooters and the e-bikes. And right now it's primarily because those things are, they're not passenger driven. We have a lot of passenger modes here in Los Angeles, and that's not one of them. So we look at it as something that people use deliberately on their own to get around. So we're actually we're in interesting times, and one of the fun things that's happening now is, and I think we may discuss this a little bit later, is we're getting requests for different types of modes coming in. So a good example right now are mopeds, which are much more motorized. So we have companies that are interested in being permitted in our city, but the issue for us is, does that fall into the micromobility bucket, or is that more like a car share? So is that like a moped share or something like that? So and should it be dockless? And those are things that we're looking at here. But for us, micromobility right now has primarily been the e-scooters and the e-bikes.
Okay, awesome, thanks. Yeah, so you already referred to Susan. Susan, how do you define micromobility? And do you see also like some changes in the definition of micromobility since you started and where we are today?
Yeah, well, I definitely feel that there's a lot of focus on shared micromobility these days, as opposed to sort of the larger concept of micromobility that I believe includes active transportation, which is riding your own device, which is typically a low-speed mode, to address Jarvis's comment about whether or not a moped would be covered by the micromobility terminology, because typically the way we define shared micromobility is it's a bike, it's a scooter, it's electrified bike or electrified scooter, and it can be docked or it can be dockless. It can be a hybrid model that includes both docked and dockless varieties. But the key commonality is that they are low-speed modes in terms of the shared micromobility definition. So what I'd encourage you to think about, though, when you're talking about micromobility is don't just think of it as something that is a shared business model, right? Is that people are getting around low speed with their own devices, and that should count as well. And I don't think we should necessarily conclude that the shared micromobility companies are here to stay. Their business models are not entirely clear, similar to other shared mobility types of services.
Okay, thanks. That's interesting to hear that we should not only think about like shared bikes and scooters, but also people just walking and biking and getting to their own place. And I actually, I don't know if the organizers let me, but I can share my screen. I have a picture of a friend that they showed some time ago. I don't know if that's a possibility. If I can, here, let me see if I share my screen here. I don't know. Does that go onto the video out there, if I may ask, or no?
It worked.
It does, right?
I can see it.
I mean, a friend of mine, he just sent me something a few weeks ago, and maybe you can see it.
Yeah.
He said like he went to a concert here, and he sent me this picture here, right? And then after that, he said the only way he could get there was on his bicycle. So I thought, like, of course, it's in the Netherlands. It's a little bit different than we see in the US, but I think for this discussion, I was just thinking, I thought like maybe the people that are in the audience, we can take away one thing about it. And I was just thinking like, when I talked to this topic about this with my friends, I was just want to say like, hey, when you give it the space it deserves, the use will automatically follow. So I think if you make it something that is attractive to people, I think that is when the use will come automatically, even if there's so many challenges and things like that. And I thought like, well, that's maybe something interesting to share for this discussion later on, you know? Mm-hmm. So anyhow, I thought like, yeah, it's not only about, as you're saying, about shared from private companies, but even if we just do our own behavior, look at our own travel behaviors and we go on bike and walking, hey, what of a difference can it make to our cities, basically, right? So yeah, so thanks for all those perspectives there. I think from there, I think what we would want to do also is like, can you give an idea about how your organization works with micromobility and how do you see the industry is evolving? And maybe Tilly, you can give an idea from that perspective and saying like, yeah, how do you see that you are working with micromobility, even TNCs, and what type of topics do you run into, you know? Can you give an idea about how that works from your side?
Sure, happy to. Sort of zooming all the way back out to the broadest definition of micromobility, San Francisco has a proud history of having a 45, almost 50-year-old transit first policy. So just right off the bat, I do advise when cities talk about this topic, be clear about what our goals are, right? And every city can determine that for itself. And San Francisco established sort of guidelines for transit first policy 40, 50 years ago, but particularly around shared mobility and private services, you know, a few years ago with the rise of the TNCs, and then of course all the different bike share with the regional bike share program. You know, we've been big supporters of that. And then eventually with the micromobility coming in, the shared private ones, not only bike share and scooter share, both sit down and stand up scooters, but also shuttle services. We had Chariot, we had Loop, or something that went away eventually, but all the different kinds of first mile, last mile sort of medium to short to medium distance private services that were trying to play in the ecosystem of San Francisco. So it became very apparent because there were both benefits and impacts, and concerns about how they were operating, who was able to access those services, what were their ultimate benefits and impacts to our transit first policy, to equity, and to our climate goals. We established sort of guidelines with our sister agency, the SFMTA. It became clear that we had both boards adopted the same principles, and our roles kind of diverged from there. We did planning, and we did sort of congestion pricing and other kind of policy studies around how to manage the transportation system. MTA sort of has the regulatory role, for example, managing the curb, as most cities will have that regulatory role, but they also took the lead on permitting. So whether it was permitting the shuttle services, ensuring that they didn't compete, but rather complemented Muni, whether it was the bike share and then the docked and eventually dockless bike share and scooters, those were the things that they've then taken the lead on. But all of our work comes from a common base of the shared mobility principles that our boards adopted, 10 of them that you would see in many cities, around sustainability, around access, around equity, around all the different labor, whole host of things. So I would just shorthand our experience by saying we're in the sort of third generation of the micromobility sort of experiment, right? The first generation was a lot of these things just appeared on our street, kind of was dumped on the street, and there were a lot of impacts, a lot of friction. We impounded them, and there were fights and all kinds of disruption, intended disruptions and unintended. Then we went into a pilot phase, and the pilot phase was with two major scooter companies. Those were evaluated, and then ultimately we moved to our permitted phase. So San Francisco, unlike other places, has decided that we would like to have a permitted system. That was the best way to kind of manage all the different interests to ensure that the public was benefiting from the new choices, these affordable, great choices, particularly for shorter trips, low impact, sustainable trips. But then we wanted to be sure that they weren't cluttering the sidewalk, and that we had equitable access across the city, and that we could measure what was going on, and so required data and other ways to kind of inform decision making and evaluation as we go.
Right. And talking about measure, I would be very interested to see, like, do those new modes basically, do they bring more people to their jobs, and does it reduce congestion? Do you have already any, before I'm gonna ask Susan, I see her already smiling because this is her lifetime work, right? She knows all the ins and outs. But just before we go to Susan, Tilly, can you just tell us what your experience is there and how you're dealing with those things?
I wish I had conclusive sort of findings, but I do have some interim findings to share because this is a very hot topic, and our colleagues at SFMTA did present on this, so I want to definitely credit Jamie Parks and Alex Demish from SFMTA, who they run this program at SFMTA, and their paper from TRB, I would definitely refer anyone to that. We're seeing about 800 devices, 4 to 6 trips per day. At one point during the pilot last year, there were 100,000 trips a month. And that's a lot of trips. Some of them, of course, came from other modes, and I'll get into that, but a good number of them, we believe, are new trips that weren't just being made before. So there's this whole question of induced trips. The average length and duration, under 20 minutes and under a mile. But basically, we're seeing good uptake, and mostly for, again, the shorter trips. A lot of them are to and from transit, but not all of them. And the question is how do we evaluate this question of are they really reducing demand congestion? Because on the mode shift surveys, we're seeing about 42% of them came from driving modes, and the vast majority of them cite TNCs. So that's kind of good, right, from a sustainable city standpoint. But 40-some%, or actually more than that, 50-some% came from walking, biking, and transit. So, how do you assess that? Is that a good thing? Is that not necessarily a great thing? It depends on if they replace those trips, if there's a net benefit to cities, from a replacement of those types of sustainable trips versus really encourage them, and we're complementary to them. So we still need better data on that, but I think the findings are that there's high demand for it. However, the demand is quite narrow, mostly male, mostly high income, and so that's a concern. We certainly knew that we needed to promote and better encourage and support accessible, equitable access from communities of concern.
Yeah, and I think I think we're going to get to that, like equitable and design. I think because it has a lot to do with equity, but also has to do with street design and safety. We're going to get touch on that in a little bit. More from an academic point of view, though, Susan, can you already say what the impacts are of some of these modes? Does it reduce congestion or increase congestion? What are your studies showing so far?
Yeah, so Arjen, are you asking me to speak to the larger ecosystem, so both TNCs and micromobility, or are you asking me to speak specifically to micromobility?
I would say first the micromobility, but maybe you can highlight how that impacts also the TNCs and how that works together, basically.
Sure. So in terms of the dockless variety, the ones that don't have their own parking location that they go into and out of, this is called docked bike sharing. There's been an enormous number of studies, perhaps in the entire shared mobility literature. This is the greatest area for academic contribution, and you might question, like, why is that? Well, it's pretty obvious, actually. It's very easy, comparatively speaking, to get the data. With this space, it's been much easier to acquire what we call activity data. So more of the trip patterns that are occurring, even the spatial generation of that data has been easier to get, along with access to the users. So a lot of that research has been done over the last decade, believe it or not. We've done some of the really large, substantial studies across North America, which include Canada and Mexico. And what we've found is a mixed bag of results. About 50% of users actually reduce their vehicle miles traveled. So it is a way to reduce auto use. In terms of its implications on public transit, that differs. And that is a story of geospatial dimensions. So where we see that it augments and serves as a first mile, last mile connector is where we have less robust transit networks. So the further we get away from the urban core, the more we see that these bike sharing trips are actually additive. However, this is where the business model breaks down more. So we really need to think about, well, maybe that's something we need to subsidize. And when we're in a place like Contra Costa County, I think there's more areas where we may face that kind of situation in a setting where there's less population density and more, a range of land use and built environments. And in particular, when we did analysis of this in Washington, D.C. and in Arlington and Alexandria, we found very different results. The further you got away from Washington, D.C.'s urban core, the more you saw bike sharing helping to promote public transit use. The more you got into the urban core, the more you saw this mode of transportation actually competing with public transit. I will say, though, it's really important to consider what the objectives of that city and transit operator are. So when we did that research about a decade ago, we talked to Metro, we talked to individuals working in the DC government, and they said, this is okay, this is exactly what we wanted. We wanted to peak shave, we wanted to create different modes of modality for people to get around the city. So they actually defined public bike sharing as a form of public transit. So for them, this was not a cause for concern. But I will say that more recently there was a study in New York, and so I've got my notes up here because I've got a lot of different studies to reference for you. In the study in New York City that focused on station-based bike sharing, they specifically found competition with buses themselves, and they saw that the docked bike sharing bikes took about 1.69 to 2.42% of people off of the buses. We also found in our North American study that there was more competition with buses than there was with rail transit. So it's important to potentially distinguish in your work between the different forms of public transit and the impacts that this can have. And before I wrap up, I wanted to just tell you that this is a really important conversation that's happening globally. This is a conversation that's happening in Paris as we speak in terms of when we provide more infrastructure and more funding for, say, shared forms of micromobility, how might that be affecting public transit, and what is the city and the transit operators' view on that particular issue? When it comes to transportation network companies, I'll just wrap up very quickly with that. You know, there's a lot of research out there. I'd say that across the studies, including a study that Tilly's organization has led, you know, it does suggest, particularly for San Francisco, that this has led to congestion. In fact, that study shows as much as 50% of the congestion is now due to transportation network companies. We also see transit competition, although we do see some transit connectivity. It really does, though, depend on land use in the built environment. I think it's very important when we do these studies, we can't do aggregate level, you know, here's 7 cities and let's aggregate up and give you the average of the impacts, because that is hiding the story, because I've already told you a story of the tale of 2 different city type environments with the use of docked bike sharing. They were very different effects on public transit.
Right. Thanks. That's much appreciated. And Jarvis, can you give an idea about how you work with micromobility and what you see as the evolvement basically over the last period of time?
Yeah, so you know, we have one of the largest scooter programs in the country, and for a time, you know, at its peak, which was pretty much during the summertime, we were operating about 36,000 scooters on the streets of LA, and we were doing a little over 1 million trips a month. So during our pilot phase, which our pilot phase is actually ending next week, we have over maybe 9 million trips, somewhere between 9 and 10 million trips on the e-scooters. But there is a question, and I think someone mentioned it earlier, that, you know, it's not fully clear that, you know, this type of service will be around, you know, forever. So I think one of the things that it's, you know, taught us is the value of data and the value of good data and verifiable data, because, you know, we have a platform that allows us to see when the scooters are locked and unlocked, and, you know, the routes that they've taken, and, you know, when the scooter is in maintenance mode and things like that. And that's something that we feel like is kind of the future of managing, you know, the streets and the roadways for cities. And so, you know, we're applying the things that we've learned on the dockless side to many of our other modes as well, you know, to kind of help us plan and determine, you know, the best ways to manage the streets going forward. So for us, we feel like, you know, we've interacted with micromobility in a good way, and it's been, you know, mostly a positive experience for us. We have 8 companies, and, you know, most of them have, you know, almost all of them have been fully compliant with us, and even with our data requirements. And that data has really allowed us to see, you know, where the trips are going and what's happening, and what's the mode split between the different modes, and also, you know, whether equity is working or not working, whether our equity concerns are being addressed. And with that data, we're able to kind of take a step back and try to review what's the best way to manage modes like this going forward. So we're not at the stage right now where we have like a version 2.0 of our program just yet. So we're still kind of doing the pilot, and we've extended our pilot for another 6 months. But a lot of that is because we're still learning about how to manage the compliance pieces and some of the other pieces that we're interested in, including how to properly manage the equity concerns that we have.
Right, and I think we'll touch on both of those things. I think we're gonna be talking about the data in a little bit, and also looking at equity. I just want to take one of the questions out of the audience that you can probably answer. Is, for example, from one question here from Maynard was, from a city's point of view, what has worked in micromobility and what hasn't, and what do you see as the future? And I think you, and your position there from the city, maybe you can give a brief answer to that question.
Yeah, so, you know, the thing that we've seen is that people use the scooters and the bikes. And so that's, you know, it's one of those things where, you know, 5, 6 years ago, you would have never thought that we'd have that kind of number in terms of usage. I mean, we were doing over 1 million trips a month, which was unheard of for a city like Los Angeles, which is so car dependent. So that's been kind of a positive, but it has gotten people to rethink, you know, how they get around and how they use things. There is a strong question of, is it a good idea that it's replaced a lot of walking trips? Because we've seen a lot of that as well, and whether it's replacing transit, but we've also seen the flip side, that it's replaced a lot of TNC trips. So there's a little bit of how to manage that, and how is that going to work. The thing that we've also learned, which I don't know if so much that we didn't know this already, but we now have kind of the figures to show it, is that, our concerns around equity and having these, these vehicles, these devices in underserved neighborhoods, we had a program where we would lower the cost. So basically the cost to permit those vehicles was half if you could commit to, having it in an underserved area. And, so we would allow the market to drive that. And what we learned was that that didn't work. The market didn't drive them to those areas. No one really took us up on the offer for the areas that we thought were most important. And so now we're, as we work on how to fix year two, we're trying to figure out what's the future of that. Is that subsidizing it? Is that mandating it? What are the ways to ensure that that happens? So that's something that we did learn, is that the market will not necessarily go to the underserved areas on its own. And maybe that's one of the reasons probably why government's in place, so that we can take that step and make sure that everyone has access to these options and not just certain parts of the city.
Right. And I think you got that information also by understanding the data. Maybe you can also tell the audience a little bit about how you're doing this, because LA basically started with a whole new concept about a data standard that's basically become the world's data standard for these types of technologies anyhow. So maybe you can just give a brief summary about what you really did and how the data standard really works, and how it can also benefit here and for CCTA, for example.
Yeah, so, when the scooters, they came, one of the things, and this is something that Selena Reynolds, who's our GM, has been very, insistent about, is that we can't just allow technology to just keep happening, to us as a city and to the population. So when they came, she really wanted to get in front of it and start to manage, early on, what are we seeing and what are we looking like? And we didn't come at it from a perspective of, let's ban them, let's impound them, let's put them away. We came from this perspective of, hey, work with us to make this a better system. So we stepped out in front and we created our own data standard. So we created what it's called Mobility Data Specification. We created it in-house, but it's an open source platform. And, we have like GitHub links that any developer, any engineer could go in and take a look and see how it's coded and what's in there, and then offer suggestions. So we really had this open platform of, help us make this a better system. And so with that being said, what we are able to see right now is, for instance, within 5 seconds, we can see when a scooter is locked or unlocked, which is basically your start trip or end trip. And then, we allow within a 24-hour period for it to distribute the routes. So this allows us to look at saturation areas and balancing and rebalancing, because we require them to rebalance. So you may deploy your scooters early in the morning, and then they go all over the place. They end up a bunch of different places. And what we don't want necessarily is to have like 500 scooters on one block. And this data allows us to see that and push out notifications to providers saying, hey, you have 400 extra scooters. We need you to rebalance them in the next 2 hours. And then we can see the movement of them being taken off so that we have a more manageable block. And we're able to do all of that in real time. So the data that we're collecting is real time. And it hasn't been without hiccups, in the sense that, we have 8 scooter companies and 7 have been fully compliant with us and have worked with us to better the standard. And we have one company that's challenging us and insisting that we shouldn't be allowed to collect this data. But it has been very helpful for us to use. And, we don't use it for profit. And one of the things that they keep putting out is that we're collecting personal identifiable information on people, and we're not. We're not collecting any person data. We're really just collecting data on where is the device located at any given time, but in real time. And so we're at a space where that's really what our data system looks like. And we're building it out, because at this stage, we're going to be we're working on putting it onto our taxi vehicles, which is one of our 4 hire modes here, so that we can start seeing what does this look like on automobiles versus just the e-scooters themselves.
So does it also mean that you added some resources in your team and people that are managing this in real time? Or do you have like a private sector partner or something like this that is really managing that division of how to move the vehicles or scooters to the city? How does that work?
Well, actually, we were able to build a team, internally that manages and looks at that data and and does those things. We do have some visualization software that we use through a third party, and that my team looks at and takes a look at all that information. But again, we've been doing regulation for a long time, and my team is the regulation permitting body. So we already have investigators and enforcement staff. I already have the administrative staff. So the thing that we needed to add was more planners, data analysts, and things like that to help manage what really is like a software-based management. But we're doing a lot of our enforcement now. It's more direct, but it's more software-based. So we're looking at things on the screen and then being able to send someone out to manage it. And really, it helps when we have the cooperation of the companies themselves. So the companies that are sending the data, we're able to go out there and validate it. So we do spot checks where we go out to a particular area, we'll scan the scooter itself, and then we'll see, does it show up on our platform, yes or no? And sometimes if it doesn't, then that's say, hey, why is this out here? How many extra ones do we have? And so we have to do this whole, you can't just allow private companies to just, run the streets ragged in any way they want. So it's really us doing a check and balance. So, but consequently though, as we can push out information to them, whether it's creating a geofence or asking them to move the scooters, it really helps that they've been proactive in taking that information and then making the proper geofence or rebalancing properly. So we've been able to do it in mostly cooperative way with a lot of our scooter companies.
Oh, fantastic. So, Tilly, how does that work in San Francisco? Did you also implement the same standards already? And how do you see developments there in your city?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Same thing. We're very grateful to LA DOT for pioneering the MDS, and we utilize it in our permitting. Our sister agency does, that is SFMTA. I think that the ability to administer and sort of enforce compliance of things like equitable access, of things like the balancing that was mentioned, the ability to kind of understand the demand, the sidewalk, sort of the use of the sidewalk and enforcing a good parking as well as a proper usage so that you're not on the sidewalk. One of the things though that has been sort of brought to light through our own hearings at my board is the self-enforcement on the part of our permittees of their own users. So that's kind of, that's weird, how do you expect your permittees to enforce their own customers as far as, bad behavior around sidewalk scootering? But those are things that are, we're now able to see because we have the ability to use the MDS specification and therefore really sort of work on those types of things. The demand is there, absolutely. I think that it does seem to be plateauing because unless you pair it with protected by, actual infrastructure, right, that protects users, you're not going to see continued growth. I feel like it is starting to plateau. We have been, however, seeing when you combine it with protected bike lanes on Valencia, which is our main bike thoroughfare, whether Better Market Street or the car-free Market Street that we just implemented recently, you do see the demand just popping back up. So it really comes back to the synergistic strategies of a city to not do these things in a vacuum, really, but to permit each of them in a way that serves your long-term strategic goals.
Right, and I think onto that, as you mentioned, hey, how many people are using the sidewalk? Are they using the roads? I see one of the questions is also like, what steps are being considered about the nuisance aspect of shared scooters and bikes? And then I think we get a little bit into curb management too, right? So how do we want to make sure that that people are using the correct right of way? So maybe, Tilly, you can actually continue on that topic and saying like, hey, why do you think curb management is so important to your local and regional infrastructure?
Yep.
And also like, how do you address basically the complaints from people of the scooters either be on the roads or being on the sidewalks? How do you go about that?
Right, so we know that there's going to be that behavior unless we plan proactively for it, because if we're seeing the demand happen and cities are not responding, there's going to be friction, there's going to be conflict, and there's going to be frustration, and sadly, some crashes. So from a safety perspective and in general, we see that cities really should be managing their curb proactively, regardless of TNCs, regardless of bike share and scooter share. This is something that cities have the jurisdiction to do, should be proactive about it, shouldn't just be, waiting for some reason to do it or a problem. So I think it's just a matter of capacity, but many of them are now working on this. It's a major topic at NACDO. I'm sure Susan can tell us more, but I know from San Francisco MTA's perspective, they are tackling this head on. The new director there, Jeff Tumlin, has announced his new initiative to really look at curb management. There are places like Sacramento and DC that are doing some great pilots with new technology providers to help cities to better manage their curb and reevaluate the use of that precious resource.
Thanks, Tilly. And Susan, do you have some suggestions also in saying like, hey, what are the most important things that we should do to improve the curb management in the short and longer term?
Yeah, well, I wanted to first tell you guys that we completed a study about a year ago for 11th Hour. It's a micromobility toolkit, and it's free for you to download. It's on my website at innovativemobility.org or imr.berkeley.edu. And that toolkit reflects a lot of the understanding that I'm sharing with you here today, but way more than I have time to share. One study that I thought was really interesting came out of Portland, and they looked at complaints about sidewalk use specific to electric scooter sharing. And what they found was about 30% of the public comments had to do with the illegal use of those sidewalks. And they also found that people had a strong preference for there being dedicated infrastructure for these devices. So in the absence of there not being dedicated infrastructure, guess where they go? They go onto the sidewalk because they feel safer there. So, so I think that's something that we really have to start talking about is if micromobility is a part of how we're going to get around, then we need to start dedicating safe infrastructure for it because it's pretty clear that accidents are happening. There was a study that I'm sure Jarvis knows about in Los Angeles looking at accident rates coming into a couple of hospitals in the LA area. And sure enough, what we are finding is some of the things that Tilly was talking about, young males, sometimes intoxicated, coming in and having some pretty fierce crashes. Now, not a lot of people were winding up in the intensive care unit, the ICU, which is a great thing, but there was a high level of incidence of this activity. And I think, the high speeds that they can travel at, the limited infrastructure for their use are things that we have to take into consideration, along with the fact, by the way, that most shared micromobility users do not wear helmets. Mm-hmm. And this is something that we've known for a very, very long time. My research dating back at least 10 to 12 years ago on the first form of bike sharing, the public bike sharing station-based model, over and over again, except for a study that I did in Utah, showed that people just don't want to wear helmets. Not sure why they want to wear them in Salt Lake City, but they did have a much higher incidence there. So just really briefly, from that micromobility toolkit that we developed, we looked at a number of case studies, and of course our friends in Santa Monica and Seattle have many different strategies. I think Seattle is a great city to look at because they have decided how to manage their curb space by developing guidelines for, in particular, a pedestrian clear zone, areas that are reserved for that specifically, as well as landscaping and street furniture, and where they even are developing these corrals that are just painted on the sidewalk for collecting the dockless bikes and scooters. And I think that's a really significant method. I know San Francisco has been requiring the locking and the docking, and I think that has been a significant measure. Our friends in Santa Monica are developing strategies that a lot of people around the world are watching in terms of standing electric scooters and saying that 8 to 14 bikes should be collected into these corrals and that they can be on the sidewalk or in the footprint of where an existing auto would be. We even see in Tel Aviv they're developing new curbside management strategies for electrified scooters and electrified bikes, so where they can corral and also co-locate electric charging. So there's lots of best practices out there, and I think one of the things I would like to just say to all of our cities is you guys are doing a great job. When your streets first started to get disrupted, as early as 2012, it was hard to keep pace with that, but I think the cities are sharing their understanding very rapidly with one another now and really trying to get ahead of this. And I think the mobility data specification is one really solid example of that, moving away from just the physicality of it to the virtual aspects of management.
Right, thanks, Susan. And Jarvis, what would you suggest also from a curb management point of view to as the most important aspects to make it basically successful, right? Do you have some tips on what can be implemented relatively quickly, and how can we also make sure that things are going to be good for the longer term?
I wish I had, some good information for you on that, but I do think that curb management is kind of the really big next frontier in terms of how we're going to manage and regulate vehicles, and whether they're micromobility or autonomous vehicles or just internal combustion engine vehicles. We're actually looking at a time right now where really it's the curb real estate that's become the most important thing, and we see it even when as these companies come in, whether it's scooter companies or even the moped companies. Much of the questions revolve around where can we place them, and a lot of that, we believe it or not, a lot of places don't have space. I mean, I lived in San Francisco many years, and I have no idea where you would put, more infrastructure for more mopeds or things like that. And the same thing in LA, we don't really have that kind of space. So then it becomes the question of, well, does the city begin to monetize that space, or even beyond monetization of it, how? And so what we really feel here in LA is that the data is really the key for that. Because now if we can see that a vehicle is sitting in a particular location, we're not really looking at being dependent on what the sign says. We're looking at being able to push that information out to the provider. And I'm talking about vehicles that are, for profit, for use. I mean, I'm not really talking about private sector yet, or, private vehicles, but I'm talking about just whether it's a taxi or TNC or a scooter or moped. We're looking at finding ways to be able to push out the information that, and dynamically moving the curve. Maybe it's, peak hours, so you can only sit here for maybe 30 minutes, or it's non-peak, so you can be there for 2 hours, and then finding a way to bill appropriately. I know that's something that we've talked about. We don't know, it's still a ways off, we think, but definitely, I think there are projects throughout the country and other places, I think, are doing what they call code the curb, which is essentially where everyone's trying to take inventory of exactly what your curb space looks like throughout your region, and then trying to figure out how to digitally manage that. So I really think that that's the future, digitally manage.
And do you also believe that that goes very closely together with your parking policies? Because of course you have a lot of cars parked on the side that both take time for longer periods of time possibly and generate possible revenue. So that's going to be probably replaced by some of those micromobility or shared mobility services in the future. And how do you see that? How do you see that happening over the next period of time?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. And I think, we do see that as something potentially for cars, coming up in the future. I mean, a lot of it is still very early because we still need to get the inventory for our streets and for the curb. So we're not at a place right now to basically say, oh, here's what we think is going to work. But what we can say is that we've definitely had that conversation because, even beyond that particular mode, we're also looking at the urban air mobility. And again, while that's not necessarily curb space, the issue for them is where can we put these vehicles? Where can we load and unload? And that's something it's a little bit like curb space. And again, digitally managing these things are really what we think is the way to go in the future, and not really using the posted signs anymore.
Right, and one of the questions that I got here that I see from Shruti here is, for example, how do you see the public engagement when you do these types of projects? How do you engage the public with these projects that you're working on?
It's in a variety of ways. It really depends on the type of project. I mean, if it's like if we were to do something like, let's say, create a place for urban air mobility, that would be an intense public process where we'd have to go out to the community We'd have to talk about the noise levels, if there are any. That's much more heavy community engagement versus we already manage curbs. So the other part of it is, we have parking meters and we remove them to put in a bike corral or something like that. That's, that kind of outreach is mostly through the council districts and talking with the constituents in the areas, usually the businesses in the areas, and kind of going out to those places and, what it's going to look like. And again, a lot of that really depends on data, because without data, you're just, you're kind of guessing in the dark of what things will look like. And now we have the data to say, hey, this is how many trips are going to be in this corridor, or this is, the amount of time that something's going to be on your sidewalk or on your street. So, we're trying to look at different ways of how to engage with the infrastructure because, as I think Susan mentioned, the infrastructure really for the micromobility piece is really the most important. And part of it is, do we start putting together stations? If we wanted to require the lock-to devices, for example, we need to have places to lock them too. And we don't really have a lot of that infrastructure in place. So the good thing is we've taken a lot of our, the permit fees from our program, and we've tried to reinvest it in the infrastructure piece because really, that's what's needed to keep it really safe, really good infrastructure.
Sure, and saying like, hey, making sure that you keep it safe, and you are having the data. Also, another question is here from Andrew is: do we think, for example, that this industry is financially sustainable? You have all the data, you know how many trips they do, you know what how much people are basically paying for their trips. Are those some of those providers coming to you and saying like, hey, can you subsidize our services, or what is the perspective that you see happening in that field?
Well, we haven't had that yet, and as much data as we get data on the devices. So we don't have a real window into their finances and how they're profiting. But we can't, I can't say this much. We wonder about it because with the scooter devices and the high usage, there is a question about how much you buy a device. Let's say it costs $1,500. At what point do you break even on that profit model, and where can you increase that profit? Is that after, so, how many trips does that take, and how long does your device actually last? So we feel that right now, those devices haven't lasted as long as maybe initially thought. So we think what we have seen though are scooter providers coming back and building stronger models. So we've seen heavy, more heavy duty scooters than we used to see. So we think they're changing, and they're changing on the fly. I mean, I can't really comment on whether the business model will last, but we do see them changing things to try to keep up with clearly things that they've seen that did or didn't work.
Sure. And I think with that data, question for Susan, now we get so much of this data coming in, right? And we know where people are traveling to and from at what time of day. Does it also help, for example, with urban design, right? If we see that there's a lot of demand at a certain place at a certain time of day for these scooters, do you think like that urban designers could possibly help in saying, hey, this is part of the infrastructure where we need to create more accessibility for non-single occupancy vehicle infrastructure, for example? Is there anything that has been done on research with using the data that Jarvis is just talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's why cities have been clamoring to get access to this data, because it is precisely what they need to understand where competition may exist with things that they are concerned about that competition, like buses and trains, and where we could designate, say, pick-up and drop-off locations, for example, for transportation network companies, or where Jarvis might want to put infrastructure in for docking and locking those bikes and scooters. So that information is absolutely crucial, and thank goodness that MDS has come around and opened up a dialogue that allows cities to say, you see, we do need this data, and it's to actually manage the whole system better. And ultimately, the private sector should benefit from a better managed system versus them thinking that they would suffer, because somebody would now have access to their secret sauce, their algorithm, right?
Right, and do you believe that data that you have, can you even extrapolate it? Let's say, hey, we have the Go Momentum station going on, for example. There is no There's no shared services maybe possibly around on the bicycles, but we know how many people are living there and how far they're living there. Can we basically, with that data already, start forecasting without having those services there and saying, hey, if we would do this or that to our infrastructure, we should expect that like 10% of all the people would go to the mobility hub on these
Yeah.
alternative modes. How do you see that developing?
So what I would say is you raise a really important question, and I would say as a data scientist, yes, those data are helpful for forecasting, but ultimately we do have to use other methods than just the activity data off of these devices. We do have to talk to people, and we have to work with people to either get their stated preference or their revealed preference data. We have to understand what would you have done if the transportation network company or the electric scooter wasn't there. And in the absence of understanding what somebody would do with a shared automated vehicle, we have to also do sensitivity analysis and create scenarios. So we can't just only rely on the activity data, particularly if we're going to get into a realm of forecasting modal distributions and changes over time from an individual basis. Activity data can only tell us so much. It's harder to predict with it without talking to human beings.
Right, so maybe Tilly, you can explain what you have done already in San Francisco and how you engage with the public and how you find out what their preferences really are. And I think after that we kind of have to start wrapping up because the hour is almost to the end. So yeah, Tilly, maybe you can give a little bit of an idea about like, hey, how did that work and how did you engage with the community and learning about these types of behavioral aspects?
Sure, thank you. This gives me a great chance to basically, once again, echo the call for research-based sort of approaches and data-based approaches, because we are so early in all these transformations, right? And we all want to know and we all want to debate things, but really we need to be led by data. So I would ask that anybody who's funding these projects and pilots or sponsoring them really ensure that we have access to good, reliable data, and even third-party or even other ways to ensure that there's transparency. Want to mention open APIs as anybody who's a developer or who has the ability to require these things in pilots. But basically, when we go out and talk to folks, we ensure that there's, we push opportunities out to them, not always electronically, because we have to go to communities and engage them. We've seen a political reaction to some of these private services, whether it's TNCs or scooters, where there's like an initial reaction that these are gentrifying, that they're displacing, that there's going to be a social impact to them. So we have to be very sensitive when we do planning. It's not just plopping down a dockless or a doctor station and hoping that the usage will be there. It really needs to be a curated and a managed and a sort of a sensitive conversation with each community. It does take a proactive company to then demonstrate that they have the capacity to do that in a culturally competent way, for example. But going back to the data, we also do, in addition to the trip data that Susan mentioned, I completely agree. We do household surveys, we do individual trip surveys now. We're collecting a new series with MTC, which is our Bay Area MPO, to basically try and specifically get at the usage of new mobility and private services from communities of concern, low-income travelers. So that really needs to supplement, as Susan said, the what happened. It's like, why did it happen? How many people were in your TNC? And what was your trip purpose? And you're going to have to ask a human being about that. The innovative thing is we're also asking, in some cases, drivers. So it's not just the passenger surveys and the sort of the household individual surveys from the traveler's point of view. Some researchers are even asking drivers to participate to get that point of view.
Yeah.
Awesome. So I think with another 1 minute to go, I just wanted to ask each of you basically like, hey, if people here at CCTA were asking like, what city or what example should they be looking at? Is there like a specific example that you would want to highlight for them to say like, hey, look at this one and see where the successes are. So maybe I can ask, I can just go around the table. Maybe Jarvis, you start first, and then Susan, and then Tilly, and then we wrap it up after that.
Yeah, I think if there's anything that we've learned in this whole process, like, we as LA, we like to be that beacon on the hill for a lot of cities, but ultimately, a lot of this is done best with other cities' input. And so for us, it's really working a lot with other cities, because even in the non-micromobility space, as we talk with other cities, I know that I engage with, Seattle and New York and Chicago and those cities quite a bit in terms of how we're all beginning to manage space and how we're going to manage and permit these new modes. And so I think really that's more helpful than anything. And I don't know if it's really just, one city that you should take a look at, but I think all the cities being cooperative has really been the big deal. And frankly, data. That's our big mantra here in LA. That data is really like the new concrete for us.
Okay, thanks, Jarvis. What about you, Susan? Any tips here for the audience?
Yeah, well, I actually just published a book chapter on looking at mobility as a service in Arlington, Virginia, and I think given my knowledge and understanding of where Randy and his organization wants to go with mobility as a service in Contra Costa County, I highly recommend looking at Arlington, Virginia, and what they're doing with platforms as well as how they manage the whole ecosystem of shared mobility.
Okay. Tilly, last word for you here.
I'll go back to the prior conversation and suggestion to really look at different cities for different things. There's different leadership everywhere from New York and LA and Seattle, DC. I can imagine, given the topic and the question, referring different cities or different folks to different cities. Each of us is a lab. I mean, even out here, especially out here in Contra Costa, I think I've been really admiring stuff that CCTA has been doing on the transportation side with partners, but also with non-traditional partners. We haven't even talked about workforce and trying to ensure that we're bringing all parts of the community into these pilots. So there's best practice both in the sort of the management and regulation. There's also the best practice in sort of the deployment and the participation by all parts of the community in these brand new services.
Great. I think with that, we'd like to finalize our session. And Randy and I were already saying before, I think in the next years we'll be still talking about this session and saying like, hey, hopefully we can still also laugh about it. He said, yeah, I hope we'll talk about it in a positive way and not that it was a disaster. So it still seemed to have worked out pretty okay, even with me not showing up and not being a teddy bear on a chair. Some final things. I think what the audience could have heard. I mean, I heard saying like, hey, demand is definitely there. There's high numbers of people that want to do it. They can come from different modes depending on where you are in your city. If you're in the high density city, it's definitely different than low density cities. But the data is basically key. But only with the data, you're not going to get there. You need to understand your audience. You need to have surveys. You need to know what's going to happen. And I think with that, I would like to conclude in saying what we started off with. I think when you give it the attention that you want it to get, I think you'll get to where you want to go. So with that, I want to thank everyone. I want to thank Tilly, Susan, Jarvis, all for being flexible with us not being there. And of course, Randy for making innovation part of his concept in another way again. So if there's anything else, no other questions, then I would ask Randy to step up to the podium and close the session.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. I know Tilly had to leave a board meeting. Thank you very much for coming all this way. And Susan, you had to leave teaching and come back home to Contra Costa because you're a Contra Costa resident. So thank you. Thank you. And Jarvis, thank you for participating, Ariane. Excellent information. Thank you for your insight. I love micromobility. I think it's going to be a great addition to our kind of array of strategies to deal with mode shift and reducing congestion here in Contra Costa County. And thank you all to all of you for joining us here today and meeting some of the smart people on the front lines that are revolutionizing transportation. How about another round of applause for our panelists and speakers today? So I hope you learned something new. I hope you take something back to your community. I hope that all is well on the way back. I mean, there was a lot of discussion about whether or not we should hold this. I think that we had the right amount of people for today's time. We could spread out, and hopefully you didn't shake anybody's hand, give them the fist bump, whatever, the leg bump. And we couldn't have done this without our team. I wanted to thank CCTA staff. You're the greatest. And AMG, you have Beth, Rose, Radine, Christina. They're just like an extension of our staff. So they're our project management consultants. So thank you to AMG. I think Paisley's in the back, Civic Edge. Thank you. You've been a long-time partner, and then Rebecca, you were here somewhere, so thank you to convey. We couldn't have done this without the sponsors. Once again, I'm going to say it again, AAA, Northern California, Nevada, and Utah, Advanced Mobility Group, AWS, Bank of America Securities, Bay Area Air Quality Management District, Bishop Branch here, Karma, CCTA, DKS, Momentum Station, Glideways. If you didn't have a chance there, have a demonstration there, virtual reality. They clean the mask. I watched them very carefully. Guided Surveying, Horizon Signal Technology, Lattice Industries, Local Motors, Nixon Peabody, PTV Group, Stantec, and Ramos Engineering Management and Telegra. So thank you again for all coming out here today. I hope you enjoyed it. Take something back and be safe as you drive home. We'll see you next year.
Thank you. Thank you. Much appreciated.